Yeshua and his ministry were gaining in recognition and popularity. After he cast out a demon from a man in a synagogue and followed that up with healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law, crowds of people flocked to him for deliverance and healing. Others followed him to hear his words. He traveled throughout the Galilee teaching in the synagogues. Luke 4:43 and 44. And he said to them, I must proclaim the gospel, the kingdom of God, to other cities, because I was sent on this mission. And he proclaimed in the synagogues of Galilee. At the time of Yeshua, rabbis would select disciples from among their followers who would then live with them and be taught intensely over a period of 3 years. They would have other students who would join them for short periods of time when they were able. Yeshua had not yet chosen disciples from among his many followers. Even Simon Peter, whom Yeshua stayed with while in Capernaum, continued in the family business of fishing. Who would Yeshua choose to be full-time disciples from among the thousands who followed him? What criteria would he use to choose his disciples? What cost would the disciples pay to follow him? I'm Brenda Cathcart, and this is Shadows of the Messiah. Yeshua's followers came from all backgrounds of Judaism. Even Pharisees and scribes or teachers of the law listened as he taught in the synagogues and the cities. Luke 5:17. Now it happened on a certain day as he was teaching that there were Pharisees and teachers of the law sitting by who had come out of every town of Galilee, Judea, and Jerusalem, and the power of the Lord was present to heal them. Yeshua could have chosen from among the scribes and Pharisees for his disciples. However, he didn't choose any of those who would have been considered good candidates. One morning, as the multitudes once more crowded around him as he taught, Yeshua got ready to choose his first disciples. Simon Peter, along with his brother Andrew and his business partners, John and James, the sons of Zebedee, had all first met Yeshua when they had traveled to the Jordan to be baptized by John the Baptist. They were there at the Jordan when Yeshua returned from his 40-day test in the wilderness and heard John's testimony about Yeshua. They traveled with Yeshua when Yeshua went back to the Galilee and attended the wedding at Cana with him. There at the wedding they saw him turn water into wine. They stayed with Yeshua as he traveled to Jerusalem to observe the Passover and throw the money changers out of the temple. But after all of this, they still had to feed their families. I'm sure that they separated from Yeshua with some reluctance as they picked up their regular lives, returning to their fishing business to provide for their families. On this particular morning, they had just come in after a night of fishing. Yeshua got into Simon's boat and had him go a little ways offshore, close enough to teach from the boat, but far enough away from the shore that there was a space between him and the crowds. After teaching for a while, Yeshua turned to Simon and told him to go fishing. Luke 5:4 and 5. When he had stopped speaking, he said to Simon, "Launch out into the deep and let down your nets for a catch." But Simon answered and said to him, "Master, we have toiled all night and caught nothing. Nevertheless, at your word, I will let down the net." Although Simon was tired and discouraged after a fruitless night of fishing, he did what Yeshua instructed. Simon didn't have an expectation of catching any fish. The type of fishing they did required startling the fish into a net that the fish couldn't see and avoid. That's why they fished at night. But contrary to Simon's expectation and experience, when they threw out the net at Yeshua's instructions, the net was filled with so many fish it nearly broke. Luke 5:6 and 7. And when they had done this, they caught a great number of fish, and their net was breaking. So they signaled to their partners in the other boat to come and help them. And they came and filled both boats so that they began to sink. Simon recognized the miracle that Yeshua did. He knew that they shouldn't have caught anything. Simon finally understood the uniqueness of Yeshua and his mission. Luke 5:8 through 11. When Simon Peter saw it, he fell down at Jesus' knees, saying, "Depart from me, for I am a sinful man, O Lord." For he and all who were with him were astonished at the catch of fish which they had taken. And so also were James and John, the sons of Zebedee, who were partners with Simon. And Jesus said to Simon, "Do not be afraid. From now on you will catch men." So when they had brought their boats to land, they forsook all and followed him. It seems ironic that when Simon, James, and John probably caught the biggest catch of their lives, they just left it behind. The other men with them, including John and James's father Zebedee, were the ones who would have brought this miraculous catch to market. It probably brought in enough income to provide for their families for some time. Why did Yeshua wait to call Simon, John, and James until after he had provided them with a harvest of fish? They had all traveled with Yeshua and witnessed other miracles. What was different about this one? This miracle was about providing both food and income for their families. Simon had a wife and probably children. James was most likely married as well. They couldn't just leave their wives and children to follow a teacher. They had loved ones who were dependent on them for the necessities of life. In providing the fish, Yeshua demonstrated that he was able to provide for them. When the call came, they forsook everything and went. What criteria did he use to choose them? One of the things we know is that before Yeshua chose them, he spent time alone in prayer to God. Luke 4:42a. Now when it was day, he departed and went into a deserted place. Yeshua now had 4 full-time disciples whom he had called in front of the witness of the multitudes of the crowd. The ones he chose were those who were going about the business of making a living. Yeshua continued his teaching and healing around the region of Galilee, centered on 3 main cities of Capernaum, Bethsaida, and Chorazin. Capernaum and Bethsaida were in different districts, with an office for collecting taxes from those who moved goods from one district to another. The tax collector would have known Simon, Andrew, James, and John, who were in the fishing business. Simon and Andrew lived in Capernaum, while James and John lived in the neighboring district in Bethsaida. They would have naturally had many encounters with Matthew, the tax collector. Alternatively, Matthew would have had ample opportunity to hear about this new rabbi, Yeshua. Little did Matthew know that one day as he sat in his office, Yeshua came by to choose him to be one of his full-time disciples. Luke 5:27 and 28. After these things he went out and saw a tax collector named Levi sitting at the tax office, and he said to him, "Follow me." So he left all, rose up, and followed him. While the choice of 4 fishermen might have been a bit confusing to the Pharisees and scribes who were professional students of the Torah of God, the choice of a detested tax collector was incomprehensible. The tax collector was not paid a set salary for collecting the tax. He basically chose his own salary by demanding whatever amount he wanted from the populace. As long as he collected enough to pay what was due to Rome, anything above that became his own earnings. There was no limit set to what he could collect. First Fruits of Zion in their work, The Chronicles of Messiah, state, tax collecting was a nasty business of cheating and stealing, and if any poor soul did not pay his taxes, the tax collector had the authority to have the man jailed until he did. Because of the dishonest nature of the business of collecting taxes, the Judaic authorities didn't consider a tax collector to be a reliable witness, and his testimony would not be accepted in a Judaic court of law. Tax collectors were considered to be among the worst violators of Torah and the greatest sinners. Even Yeshua stated that tax collectors should be shunned, Matthew 18:15 through 17. Moreover, if your brother continues to sin against you, go and show him his fault, but privately, just between the 2 of you. If he listens to you, you have won back your brother. If he doesn't listen, take 1 or 2 others with you, so that every accusation can be supported by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to hear them, tell the congregation. And if he refuses to listen even to the congregation, treat him as you would a pagan and a tax collector. The tax collector was shunned in Jewish society. Deceiving and avoiding a tax collector was not only accepted by the Jewish authorities, it was almost regarded as a commandment. Yet Yeshua chose one of the despised tax collectors to be his disciple. He even went so far as to go into the tax collector's home and eat with him. Luke 5:29. Then Levi gave him a great feast in his own house, and there were a great number of tax collectors and others who sat down with them. Who were the friends of a tax collector? They would have to be other tax collectors and others who were on the fringe of acceptable Jewish society. How could these sinners be expected to keep the kosher rules? What types of food would be served, and did they keep the kosher preparation standards? A Pharisee would not dare to eat in such a household where he couldn't verify the level of Torah and kosher observance. First Fruits of Zion explains in their work The Chronicles of Messiah. The Pharisees' strict tithing and purity standards forced them into exclusive fellowships called Havarim. The Pharisees referred to a fellow Pharisee who met their standards as a Haver, or friend. The Pharisees considered Yeshua a Haver, that is, they considered him a fellow Pharisee. If they did not, they would not have invited him to eat with them as they frequently do in Luke, nor would they have held him to the standards of the Havarim. That Yeshua would eat with tax collectors and Jews who almost certainly did not keep the same strict observance of Torah that they did baffled and confused the scribes and Pharisees. Luke 5:30. And their scribes and the Pharisees complained against his disciples, saying, "Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?" This question was about more than the company Yeshua was keeping. They were asking how Yeshua could risk his own Torah observance by eating in a place that had suspect Torah practices. Yeshua's answer acknowledges that the company of tax collectors was not the place to find those who practiced righteousness. Luke 5:31 and 32. Jesus answered and said to them, "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." We sometimes miss that by acknowledging the tax collectors as sinners, he is also acknowledging that the Pharisees and scribes are those who practice righteousness. This may have consoled them somewhat, but they were still hurting that Yeshua hadn't chosen any of them to be his disciples. This is evident when they now turn their questioning to the behavior of Yeshua's disciples. Luke 5:33. Then they said to him, "Why do the disciples of John fast often and make prayers, and likewise those of the Pharisees, but yours eat and drink?" To understand this question, we turn again to custom and practice in the days of Yeshua. Many schools of Pharisees regularly fasted once or twice a week, in addition to other times of fasting for specific events. At this time, John the Baptist was in prison, and his disciples were most likely fasting frequently for his release. Yeshua, as a supposed friend of John, surely would have his disciples fasting as well. It was as if these Pharisees were asking, "Don't your disciples even know enough to realize they should be fasting regularly, especially for the release of John and for relief from the other atrocities the Romans have inflicted on us?" Yeshua's answer was in two parts. The first part is the direct answer to why his disciples don't fast. Luke 5:34 and 35. And he said to them, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while the bridegroom is with them? But the days will come when the bridegroom will be taken away from them. Then they will fast in those days." Since the Pharisees brought up John, Yeshua referred to John's words that Yeshua was the bridegroom. John 3:28 and 29. "You yourselves bear me witness that I said I am not the Christ, but I have been sent before him. He who has the bride is the bridegroom, but the friend of the bridegroom who stands and hears him rejoices greatly because of the bridegroom's voice. Therefore this joy of mine is fulfilled." Yeshua plants two seeds with this statement. The first is that since he is the bridegroom John refers to, then he is the Messiah. His presence alone is reason for his disciples to rejoice and not fast. Second, Yeshua introduces the idea that he will suffer. He states that he will be taken away and his removal will be cause for fasting. The second part of Yeshua's answer is a parable that defends his choice of disciples. Luke 5:36-39. Then he spoke a parable to them. No one puts a piece from a new garment on an old one. Otherwise the new makes a tear, and also the piece that was taken out of the new does not match the old. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine will burst the wineskins and be spilled, and the wineskins will be ruined. But new wine must be put into new wineskins, and both are preserved. And no one, having drunk old wine, immediately desires new, for he says, the old is better. As we attempt to understand this double parable, we have to put it in the context of which Yeshua was speaking. This passage in Luke is primarily about Yeshua choosing his disciples. It opens with the choice of Simon, Andrew, James, and John. In the middle, Yeshua chooses Matthew. Afterwards, he makes known his choice for the inner 12 disciples. Specifically in this parable, he was answering the implied question of the Pharisees about his choice of disciples. This parable then is about the choice of disciples. Historically and culturally, we need to understand the symbols used in the parable. What would the Pharisees who heard this parable understand it to mean? The Chronicles of Messiah reveals that the parable is discussing different types of teachers and disciples. In a quotation of the Mishnah Avot, the Chronicles of Messiah relates, Elisha ben Avuyah said, "He who studies as a child, unto what can he be compared? He can be compared to ink written upon a fresh new sheet of paper. But he who studies as an adult, unto what can he be compared? He can be compared to ink written on a smudged, previously used and erased sheet of paper." Rabbi Meyer said, "Do not pay attention to the container, but pay attention to that which is in it. There is a new container full of old wine, and here is an old container which does not even contain new wine." In Yeshua's parable, both the old garment and the old wineskin are previously educated students. In context, this would refer to the Pharisees and Sadducees who would bring their previous teaching and understanding with them as they attempt to understand Yeshua's words. They are the smudged sheet of paper. The new garment and the new wineskin are uneducated students. In context, these would be the disciples Yeshua chose whose thinking had not been confused by studying under other teachers. They are the fresh sheet of paper. The new patch and the new wine are the teachings of the new teacher. The new patch on the old garment would merely gloss over the old teaching. It would be unlikely to transform their understanding of Torah. This would prove to be the case since the Pharisees and scribes had difficulty accepting Yeshua as the Messiah. The old wine would be the previous teaching. Those with previous teaching, the old wineskins, would continue to prefer the old teaching, the old wine, saying, "Surely the old is better." Yeshua was telling the scribes and Pharisees that he chose fresh students because they could better understand his words. And he didn't choose them because they would not be able to understand what he taught. He didn't choose them, at least partly, because of the way they held themselves rigidly away from their fellow Jews. Peter and the other disciples learned well from their Rabbi Yeshua. When they were brought before the Sanhedrin to explain their authority to heal and to teach, they boldly proclaimed that Yeshua was not only their rabbi, he was the Messiah. Acts 4:10-13. Let it be known to you all and to all people of Israel that by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified, whom God raised from the dead, by him this man stands here before you whole. This is the stone which was rejected by you builders, which has become the chief cornerstone. Nor is there salvation in any other, for there is no other name under heaven given among men by which we must be saved. Now when they saw the boldness of Peter and John and perceived that they were uneducated and untrained men, they marveled, and they realized that they had been with Jesus. Yeshua chose his disciples from among those whose hearts hungered for God. He chose from the businessmen, sinners, tax collectors, and revolutionaries. They put aside their preconceived ideas about Messiah and learned from him. Their understanding caused the religious leaders of their day to marvel. Their discipleship cost them everything, which they all gladly paid. With the exception of John, they all died martyrs' deaths. As followers of Yeshua, we too need to put aside our preconceived ideas about Messiah and listen carefully to all the words that he spoke as recorded for us in the Gospels and other writings of the first disciples of Yeshua. We need to understand his words in the context of the history and culture of the day, as well as in context of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, which Yeshua calls the words of his Father. And let us be like Peter and boldly proclaim that Yeshua is our Rabbi and our Messiah. I'm Brenda Cathcart. This has been Shadows of the Messiah. Shalom and be blessed.